Support for this podcast comes from Invent Together. I bet you didn't know that inventing activity by Black inventors peaked in 1899, and it has never recovered. Black and Hispanic college graduates patented half the rate of white college graduates. That's just one of the reasons why you need to know about Invent Together. When our patent system gets more diverse, our nation will get stronger and more successful. Find out how you can help diverse inventors and unleash economic opportunity at inventtogether.org.
In this episode, Matt Kelly and I unpack the SAP trade sanctions enforcement action for doing business directly and indirectly with Iran.
Interested in taking a deep dive each week into a compliance or compliance-related topic? Then Compliance Into the Weeds is the podcast for you. Join Matt Kelly, the coolest guy in compliance, and Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, as they go into the weeds to flesh out a story which you can use to better inform your compliance program. Both you and your compliance program will be the better for listening to this podcast. Compliance Into the Weeds is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, back again with Matt Kelly, the coolest guy in compliance, for another episode of Compliance Into the Weeds. In this podcast, we're going to take at least a dive. We may take additional dives into the SAP export control settlement that came out last week. Matt blogged about it, and we wanted to visit with you about it. So, Matt, first of all, welcome.
Hello, Tom. Good to be here.
So, Matt, this was, I think, the first settlement, export control settlement under the new OFAC export control program. There was lots to unpack, from the substantive violations, from the how SAP remediated this, and how the government evaluated the conduct of SAP, and indeed in the non-prosecution agreement. Where do you want to start?
We could probably just start with the facts of the case. So this came out fairly late Thursday afternoon, and I popped it up last Friday, but the case is still relatively new. What happened was that in the 2010s, from 2010 into, I think, well into 2017, SAP, which is one of the world's largest business software providers, they were violating U.S. sanction law by allowing software sales or downloads or software patches to customers or businesses or users who were in Iran. So big violation of U.S. sanctions law if you have anything to do with Iran. And basically what happened was SAP violated this in 4 different ways. First, they were releasing software patches, upgrades, and other products and all of that you could download through an operating center in the United States called a content delivery provider. So anybody anywhere in the world could go to the content delivery provider facility in the United States and download your SAP patch. And apparently a lot of Iranian interests did that repeatedly throughout the 2010s. So there was a whole bunches and thousands, tens of thousands of software violations that way. Each one of those downloads was a sanctions violation. We had some SAP partner firms around the world in Germany. SAP is a German firm, by the way. Turkey, Malaysia, in Dubai. They were selling SAP software to shell companies that were actually fronts for Iranian interests. So 14 more violations of U.S. sanctions law. There were apparently a number of large multinational companies that were legitimate SAP customers and had business in Iran. And if you're not a global business, if you're not a U.S. business, you could probably straddle that fence, except you couldn't have SAP selling support to you couldn't be buying SAP software for your business operations in Iran. But that did happen with 31 large multinational companies. Who are those companies? We don't know. And then fourth, and this I think was actually most interesting, was that SAP throughout the 2010s, like many large tech companies, went on a hiring spree, bought a lot of US-based cloud software providers. So SAP owns Ariba, which is a big payment system. I think it owns Concur. It owns SuccessFactors, which is an HR management software business. Owns all of these firms. and then allowed Iranian interests to access their services through the cloud because they did not geo-screen the IP addresses of their SAP users to screen out anybody with an IP address in Iran, which is a pretty straightforward thing to do. And SAP did not do it. So we have 4 different ways that SAP was violating sanctions law. We had a total of, I think, 25,000 individual sanction violations. So the U.S. Justice Department, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, and the Commerce Department in its Bureau for Industry and Security, all 3 of them had a joint enforcement against SAP, announced $8 million in penalties, $5.1 million more in profit disgorgement, and then also a 3-year non-prosecution agreement. Those are just the facts of what happened, and we can get into the compliance program response, which is really interesting, but you don't see too many big cases like this in the realm of Iranian sanctions violations. So this was notable.
Man, I think one of the things that grabbed my attention in the non-prosecution agreement was the DOJ made very clear that SAP stepped forward and not only investigated this matter thoroughly, but also remediated extensively, but also cooperated with the Department of Justice, with OFAC, and perhaps other agencies of the U.S. government. It seemed that it was pretty robust. Is that the sense you got?
Absolutely, yeah. So the acting head of the Justice Department's National Security Division, who were the lead prosecutors here, they flat out said as much. They're the actual quote, I think, from John Demers, who was an assistant attorney general. He said that this could have been far worse had they not disclosed, cooperated, and remediated. We hope that other businesses, software or otherwise, will heed this lesson. It looks like, from the facts that have been disclosed here, of course, we had a couple of whistleblower allegations come in over the course of the years, and where did they go? Looks like it's unclear how responsive SAP was to internal whistleblowers trying to raise alarms. But at some point by 2017, it was doing an internal investigation into its potential sanctions violations, realized we have a problem, and we have a big problem potentially, but still, SAP went to the Justice Department and OFAC and the Commerce Department and confessed its sins, undertook several different remediation steps, and the Justice Department singled out 6 steps. We can talk about those in a moment. But the other interesting point was that the Justice Department's press release did say SAP spent more than $27 million on its remediation efforts. So they do get a non-prosecution agreement. And another interesting point, Tom, is you did say this is the first settlement we have under the export control compliance program, which is really just the FCPA corporate enforcement policy applied to export control violations. Same 3 things: self-disclose, remediate, cooperate. This is the first one that we have under the export control policy. But if you go back to when they announced it in 2019, which I did, and you look at the aggravating factors that would typically lead to charges or some sort of much more serious accusation, that would include long and pervasive misconduct, which, okay, 7 years, rather egregious conduct. Okay, yeah, you didn't put in IP tracking, which is pretty standard these days. There were several different aggravating factors SAP did have, according to the policy that had been announced in 2019. They still get away with a non-prosecution agreement, which seems like a good resolution to me. And here we have the Justice Department explicitly saying, guys, it's because they lived up to the program. So I guess one lesson here is even if you have some pretty egregious and aggravating stuff going on, it's still going to be worth it to fall on your sword, come clean, remediate, and you will get a favorable resolution. According to the DOJ and the very nice statement that they put out about SAP's cooperation last week.
So the other thing was the proposed or original penalty was pegged at, according to your blog, was pegged at the by the DOJ at 27. Yet we have $8 million in penalty among the Department of Justice, OFAC, and Commerce. So it looks like they got a pretty hefty discount for the work they did under the corporate enforcement policy. Would that be correct?
It looks like it. And I follow OFAC enforcement actions specifically. I follow them pretty closely. And you see that a lot with the OFAC deals, is they will say the statutory maximum for whatever misconduct in question is $8 zillion. But we have decided this is not egregious. We have decided that when we weigh the aggravating factors and whatnot, it'll be a civil penalty of only $1 zillion. And now we're going to do more of our factors and calculations. And it's not going to be a zillion. It's going to be 500,000. Or in SAP's case, it's $8 million. But there's an awful lot of discounting that does go on from the statutory maximums, which are always sky high. But still, I think it's very clear and correct to say that SAP could have had a much bigger punch in its teeth, and they didn't. It makes $32 billion a year in revenue, so it's not like even $13 million is going to be a big sting. But nonetheless, things could have been worse for SAP, and they weren't. And all through all of these releases, everybody is pointing to the great cooperation and remediation that SAP gave once they did realize we have a problem, we need to come clean.
So, Matt, the technical steps followed by SAP to obtain the finding, or rather the resolution they did, I thought were pretty well laid out and are very instructive. To me, I really appreciated your larger point that you ended your blog post with, that having automated due diligence is certainly something that everyone should have in place. And OFAC has really made that a cornerstone, I think, of what they view as the best practices in compliance and a compliance program. But it's really a much bigger issue. It's number one, the human element, but you phrased it in, this is not third parties, this is risk management, and you have to take a much broader approach. I was wondering, one, did I interpret you correctly? And two, could you maybe expand upon that part of your blog post a little bit?
Well, I do think that it was interesting to see that OFAC and the Justice Department talked a lot about the automated screening. And you're right that FCPA compliance people are going to understand that's probably a good way to handle third-party due diligence, is to automate it, because otherwise you're going to have a lot of work. But it doesn't actually say anywhere in the FCPA statute or in all the guidance that you have to use automated screening software or we're going to nail you to the wall. Well, in export controls, yeah, they do say that. It is very clear in their guidance about what an effective export program is, that you should use automated screening software. And if you miscalibrate your software, we will nail you on a violation and we'll impose a fine, which OFAC has done. And now it's happening again here. So it really drives home the point that, if you're going to be doing due diligence for third parties in one way, you really should be doing it for your third parties in all potential ways that the third party might bring you grief. For big global companies, that is going to include export controls. And a lot of it is just knowing who are your third parties. With export control, I think it's a lot more about who is your customer. In FCPA land, it's a lot more about who is my vendor or who is my agent. And maybe a little bit less important about who is your customer, although that's still going to be important. But all of this is just like, how much do we want to kind of sort of duplicate what we're doing for third-party risk oversight? Knock yourself out, because you could duplicate it a whole lot of ways, or you could take a much more unified chief third-party risk oversight officer sort of a role, whether that's a FCPA compliance officer, an export controls officer, some sort of chief risk officer who knows how to do very comprehensive oversight of third parties. That's where we're getting to. I mean, how often, Tom, are you and I going to go through a different case next month that's going to talk about a third party that somehow brought some sort of regulatory grief to the company we're talking about? It goes on and on. So you really should be thinking about how can you get a more comprehensive approach to your third parties.
Matt, there were two other areas of risk that came up for me when I read the non-prosecution agreement. You touched on one a little bit earlier when you talked about mergers or actually just acquisitions by SAP of cloud service providers in the United States who really had insufficient export control programs, and those were not remediated or brought up to SAP standards. But the second part was the patches that went out and sort of the ongoing standard communications almost every software company has with its customers in terms of either routine maintenance and support, ongoing patches and bug fixes, and other communications. And it pointed out to me that due diligence and indeed third-party risk management is not either a one-time procedure or even a series of steps, but it's an ongoing relationship. And that simply because you have a customer that you previously approved, if you continue to do business and communicate with that customer, and that customer is then passing that information along, you're going to get in trouble like SAP did. What did you see in either or both of those situations?
Well, I think that really drove home the point that for a lot of businesses these days, and especially a lot of technology firms, you're not going to have a one-time transaction with your customer where you could figure out physically, where is this person? They're in Iran. I'm not going to do any business with them. You don't necessarily know that if you're doing some sort of online transaction. But if you are selling software, then you're going to wind up providing follow-up software patches, vulnerability fixes, upgrades, and whatnot. Everybody who has an iPhone knows that you have a long-term relationship with Apple now because you're downloading their latest iOS. I'm sure that's the same for all the other devices and whoever else has other sort of non-Apple products in your home. You know, you wind up with a much more longitudinal relationship with your customer, and also coupled with the fact that it's an online transaction only, an online relationship only. So you really have to start thinking much more about who are these people? Where are they coming from? That's not difficult to find out. You can check IP addresses and you can find out who are your customers downloading from North Korea or Iran, or they were downloading in Jordan first, but now for whatever reason they're in Iran this year. When did that happen? Well, now it's a violation. You can check those things. The technology does exist. And the regulators were very clearly saying through the SAP enforcement action here that the tech exists, so you got to put it into place. Also, Tom, it is well worth noting that SAP does sell screening software. So that is just one more slightly ironic or poetic twist to this little case. I'm not quite sure where the misconfiguration of their screening tools, especially for their US-based cloud service providers, I'm not sure where that all went off the rails, or if people were using SAP software within SAP or out of, we don't have that detail. But I do know that SAP does sell screening software, and it just got dinged on having inappropriately constructed or operated screening software. So that's why it's fun to be in this business.
The non-processing agreement also mentioned briefly national security issues. That's not something we typically see in an FCPA settlement, but with the ongoing imbroglio between the United States and Iran, would we expect to see national security raise its head in these types of export control issues going forward?
I mean, I think it could. I think it would depend on the company. And, you know, for example, SAP, do they sell software that could conceivably be used to run a large organization developing terrorism weapons in Iran? Sure, they could. Yeah, SAP makes great software that large businesses all over the world use. And so if it wound up supporting the Iranian Department of Missile Research, that would not be good for SAP, and that would very much be a national security concern. I have no idea who the actual Iranian interests were. That's not disclosed in any of these documents, who they were, who were getting SAP downloads. But in theory, if you are selling into these national security targets, Iran, North Korea, possibly Venezuela, and a couple of other highly corrupt places, you have to think that, yeah, you're going to wind up talking with the National Security Division. And you're right, we don't often talk about it, Tom, but here we are. It happens.
Turns out there was really a lot to unpack from this order. We had our traditional favorite of due diligence. We've had risk management. We've had mergers and acquisitions. We had red flags raised by external law firm. We had potential in-house whistleblowers. before we even got to the remediation or the steps SAP took. With all of that going on, or there's 2 or 3 things that you could synthesize this down to?
Well, I'm actually really interested in how this action corresponds to OFAC's guidance on an effective export control compliance program, which I think OFAC put out in either 2018 or 2019. It's been around. But OFAC really did communicate in that guidance that your sanctions compliance program is not going to be easy. This is a complex thing. You are well served, if you are a large company with export control issues, to have a dedicated sanctions compliance team that handles all of this stuff. And you really do have to be on the technology you use to keep track of these constantly changing lists of who is or isn't on a sanctions list. And that's just within the U.S. We haven't even mentioned that you have UK, Canadian, other sanctions, other countries with their own sanctions regimes, or EU sanctions. So this gets very complicated very quickly. And ultimately, you're going to solve that by having really competent human talent operating really well calibrated and thoughtful technology. And that's, you zero in on those 6 things that the 6 remediation steps that the DOJ praised. That's what it's all about. It is about correctly configuring the tech because you have human export control expertise who know what they're doing. And so you're going to have that if you wind up with export control risks. OFAC and the Justice Department are clearly saying those things are not a joke. Take it seriously.
I don't think I could have said it or asked for it to be said any better. So let's just end on that.
All right, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Compliance Into the Weeds. We're going to link to Matt's blog post on this topic in our show notes. If you have any questions, you can email Matt at mkelly@radicalcompliance.com. You can email Tom at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. I would urge you to check out some of the other podcasts on the Compliance Podcast Network. We have a great series from Mikhail Ryder-Gordon on the Wirecard saga. This week on the Compliance Life, we have the final episode from Jonathan Kellerman. The Compliance Into the Weeds podcast is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. Thank you for listening.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.